The Deep South has always been a place of quiet battles, but tonight it's become a war zone. The Blooded Sons have just made their biggest mistake, marching into a black town with fire and fury, expecting to find an easy target, a town of black families too isolated to fight back, too afraid to resist. They came with 30 armed men, with torches and rifles, with a certainty that this place would fall like so many before it. Instead, they've walked into a battlefield designed by warfighters. Marcus Kane, a man the world once called Ghost, an operator who left bodies in the sand before returning home to something worth protecting. Darius Hayes, a sniper whose eye has never missed when it mattered most. Leon Carter, a demolitions expert who turns arrogance into tombs. Samuel Evans, a medic who's seen too much blood to let this town bleed. For the people of Haven's Rest, this wasn't just another act of hate. It was a war for survival in an increasingly hostile America. Before we go any further, make sure to subscribe and comment if you have ever experienced racism. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over Haven's Rest, bathing the quiet streets in hues of deep amber and gold. The air was thick with the scent of magnolia and the distant aroma of smoked barbecue drifting from a backyard pit somewhere down the road. It was the kind of peace that Marcus Kane had fought for overseas but never truly found. Until now. He walked alongside Darius Hayes, Leon Carter, and Samuel Evans, his closest friends. Men he had bled with, killed with, and nearly died with on foreign soil. They had come home to Haven's Rest, not because they were running from war, but because they had hoped to leave it behind. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Leon said, hands in his pockets as he took in the sight of kids playing in the street, old men gathered on porches swapping stories over glasses of iced tea, women laughing as they exchanged bags of groceries. "It's peaceful," Darius muttered. Marcus nodded, though he knew better than to believe in peace. The world didn't work that way. That's when they heard it. Engines. Loud, roaring engines. They turned just in time to see a convoy of lifted trucks tearing through the town square, dust kicking up behind them like a storm rolling in. Big tires, tinted windows, American and Confederate flags waving from the beds, shotguns propped up against dashboards. Something about the way they moved, fast, reckless, too confident, made Marcus's gut tighten. Leon had already shifted, angling his body slightly, instinctively prepared for a fight. Darius followed their trajectory with sharp, calculating eyes. And then the trucks were gone, speeding down the road toward the outskirts of town, leaving behind nothing but the echo of their engines and the growing tension that now settled in the air. That's when they saw him, lying in the dirt, barely moving. A man too old to be treated this way, too respected to be left like this. Reverend Elijah Brooks. Samuel was the first to move, dropping to his knees beside him. The old man's face was swollen, one eye shut, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. His breathing was labored, and even as Samuel tried to check his vitals, Elijah gripped his wrist, holding on with what little strength he had left. Marcus crouched beside them, his voice low, steady. "Who did this?" Elijah exhaled shakily, his fingers curling against Samuel's arm, as though holding on to his last breath. His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "They said this town ain't ours no more." Silence. A long, slow-burning silence, the kind that stretched just before a trigger was pulled. Marcus stood, rolling his shoulders, jaw tightening, eyes cold as death. Leon wiped a hand down his face, exhaling sharply, muttering, "Well, I guess war ain't done with us after all." Darius nodded toward the direction the trucks had gone, his voice as sharp as broken glass. "So let's find out who just signed their death warrant." Samuel pressed a damp cloth against Elijah Brooks's temple, his hands steady despite the quiet storm brewing inside him. The old man winced but said nothing, his breathing slow, deliberate, as though he knew any sudden movement might unravel the fragile hold he had over his pain. The four men had brought him to the small medical clinic near the town center, a modest building with faded white walls and a single overhead fan that turned sluggishly, stirring the thick, humid air. The town doctor, an older woman named Miriam Wallace, worked quickly, examining the bruises, checking for broken ribs, doing what she could with what little she had. Marcus leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face unreadable as his gaze swept over the room, taking in every detail. The way Elijah's knuckles were scraped raw, the way his clothes were torn, the deep, ugly swelling along his jawline that told him the old man had been struck more than once. Not in some random act of violence, but with intent. Darius stood near the window, his sharp eyes scanning the street outside, watching for movement, for signs that the men who had done this were lurking, waiting to finish what they started. He had seen this before, not here, not in Haven's Rest, but in places overseas, in villages where men with power and weapons had tried to erase the people they deemed unworthy of existing. It always started small. A broken window, a missing person, a message carved into someone's flesh, and it always escalated when no one pushed back. Leon, standing near the doorway, exhaled through his nose, a deep, measured breath, the kind that barely contained the frustration burning beneath his skin. His hands curled into loose fists at his sides, his voice low, steady, controlled. "You gonna tell us what happened, Elijah? Or we gotta start making some guesses?" The old man didn't answer right away. His fingers twitched against the edge of the examination table, as though he was considering how much to say, or maybe whether it even mattered. But then his shoulders rose with a slow, tired breath. And when he spoke, his voice was rough, worn down like the bark of an old tree that had weathered too many storms. "They said Haven's Rest was a mistake," Elijah murmured, his swollen eye barely able to open, but his remaining gaze fixed on Marcus, as if he knew out of all of them, he would be the one to understand what that meant. "They?" Marcus asked, though he already knew. Elijah's fingers curled slightly. His voice quieter now, but no less certain. "They called themselves the Blooded Sons." The name settled into the room like an unwelcome guest. Marcus didn't move, didn't react, but something in the air shifted. A stillness that felt like the moment before a sniper pulled the trigger. Samuel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I should have known." Leon's jaw tightened. "Sounds like one of those little internet groups that talk big when they got numbers and anonymity, but ain't worth a damn when they're standing face to face with a real fight." Elijah chuckled, but the sound was weak, almost hollow. "They ain't just talking, son. They're doing." Marcus finally pushed off the wall, stepping closer, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of something far heavier than words. "What did they say?" Elijah swallowed, his throat working around the pain. "They told me we weren't supposed to be here, that we built something in a place where we didn't belong, that our town, our families, our history was a stain they were going to wipe clean." The words hung in the air, thick and unmoving. They weren't just threats, they were promises. Darius finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual, but sharper, like the edge of a knife. "They ever come like this before?" Elijah nodded, just barely. "They started small, like all cowards do. A few broken windows, some spray paint on the church doors, slashed tires. Then a house burned down last month, old Miss Avery's place. She's been living here since before I was born, and they didn't care. Nobody got hurt. But that wasn't the point. They were testing us, seeing how much we'd take before we pushed back." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. He had seen this before, in other places, in other wars. Terror wasn't about the first strike. It was about conditioning, making people feel helpless, convincing them that resistance was useless, that one day they would wake up and realize they had lost everything before they even knew they were in a fight. "Sheriff know about this?" Leon asked, his tone edged with disbelief, though the answer was already obvious. Elijah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, he knows, but he ain't lifted a damn finger. He came by after Miss Avery's place went up, told us he'd look into it. That was it. The next week, someone put a noose on my front porch. You think he came by then? Leon's fingers twitched, and Darius let out a slow, controlled breath, grounding himself before the frustration took hold. Samuel was silent, his jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. "How many of them are there?" Marcus finally asked. Elijah exhaled, shaking his head. "Enough." Marcus turned to Darius, whose eyes were already on him, a silent understanding passing between them. "We need to find out exactly how many," Marcus said, his voice calm, measured. "We need to know what they have, who's backing them, and what their next move is. Because they're not done, not yet." Elijah shifted, looking at him, something dark and knowing in his one good eye. "You sure you want to get involved in this, son? This ain't your war." Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. "It is now." The room fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't uncertain or heavy with hesitation. It was absolute. Darius stepped away from the window, rolling his shoulders. "I'll start with the local bars. See if anyone's been running their mouth about who they answer to." Leon nodded. "I'll check the truck stops. These kinds of cowards always got people on the outside funding them, supplying them. If they're getting help, we need to know where it's coming from." Samuel grabbed his medical bag, checking its contents like a soldier inspecting his rifle. "I'll go see Miss Avery. If they burned her house, she might have seen something before they did it." Marcus didn't move, his mind already running through the next steps, the next choices, the next kills that would have to be made. Because this wasn't about just finding out who was responsible. It was about making sure it never happened again. "We meet back at my place in 2 hours, he said finally. "This ends before it starts." Elijah let out a slow breath, watching them. Something unreadable in his expression. He had seen men fight before. He had watched people rise up and get crushed, watched history repeat itself time and time again. But this time, something was different. This time, the ghosts were already moving. Marcus moved through the streets of Haven's Rest like a shadow, his boots quiet against the pavement, his presence unnoticed by the handful of people still out this late. Most of the town had settled in for the night, doors locked, lights dimmed, a quiet unease hanging in the air, like the calm before a storm. The people of Haven's Rest had spent generations building something that should have been untouchable, a place where black families had carved out prosperity, safety, and dignity in a world that had tried to deny them all three. But the blooded sons had made their intentions clear. They weren't here to take over. They were here to erase. Marcus had spent his life studying men like them. He had seen their kind on different soil, different flags draped over their shoulders, different causes on their lips. But the sickness was always the same. Men who needed an enemy to define themselves, who could only see their own strength when someone else was on their knees. It wasn't enough for them to thrive. Others had to suffer. Sheriff Tate had been a dead end. Marcus had stopped by the station first, more out of principle than any real expectation of cooperation. Tate had been sitting behind his desk, feet up, flipping through a hunting magazine, his expression unreadable when Marcus mentioned the name The Blooded Sons. He had shrugged, muttered something about no evidence and boys being boys, and then dismissed him with an empty promise to keep an eye on things. Marcus hadn't pressed. Tate wasn't the kind of man you reasoned with. He was the kind of man who waited until the smoke cleared so he could pretend he'd been neutral all along, which meant Marcus needed another source. He turned down a back alley, moving past the old general store, its windows dark, past a rusted-out pickup that hadn't moved in years, until he came to a bar that barely deserved the title, The Last Stop. It was a place built for men like Tate, men who liked their company the same color as their liquor, pale and cheap. Marcus had never stepped foot inside, never had a reason to, but he knew its reputation. It was where the men who talked about the good old days whispered about ways to bring them back. He pushed open the door, stepping inside, his entrance barely noticed by the handful of regulars hunched over their drinks. Cigarette smoke lingered thick in the air, masking the scent of stale beer and sweat. A couple of old songs hummed low from a jukebox in the corner, but the place was mostly silent, men drinking with their heads down, lost in whatever thoughts made the world outside feel smaller, simpler. Marcus moved to the bar, nodding at the bartender, a wiry man with deep lines on his face and a permanent frown carved into his features. His name was Buck Rawlins, a man with no real loyalty beyond the price of a drink, and someone who had a habit of knowing things he shouldn't. "Kane," Buck said, his tone neutral but his eyes watchful. "Didn't think this was your kind of place." Marcus ignored the bait. "Looking for some information. Do you know anything about the Blooded Sons?" Buck exhaled through his nose, wiping a glass with a rag that looked like it had seen better days. "Name rings a bell." He didn't look up. "But ringing bells don't mean much unless you're listening real close." Marcus leaned against the bar, voice low. "I'm listening." Buck finally looked up, considering him for a long moment. Then he sighed, tossing the rag onto the counter. "I heard talk." "That what you want?" Marcus didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited. Buck scratched his jaw, then spoke, casual, like he was commenting on the weather. "They don't like what Haven's Rest is. Say it don't fit." He poured himself a drink, took a slow sip. "Say it's an insult. A town like this, standing as long as it has, makes them feel small." He chuckled to himself, shaking his head. "And you know men like them, Kane. Ain't nothing in this world they hate more than feelin' small." Marcus didn't respond. He already knew that truth better than most. Buck glanced around, then lowered his voice slightly. "Word is, their boss got more boys comin' in. They ain't just burnin' stores no more. This ain't about sending a message. It's about cleaning house." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "When?" Buck hesitated. "Dunno, but soon." Marcus pushed away from the bar. "Where is he?" Buck exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I ain't got a death wish, Kane." Marcus let the silence stretch between them, long enough that Buck shifted uncomfortably. Then, finally, he gave the slightest nod toward the back exit. Marcus didn't thank him. He turned and left, stepping out into the night air, the humidity wrapping around him like a second skin. The alley behind the bar was dark, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp down the road. He moved carefully, staying close to the wall, footsteps light. And then he heard it, a grunt, a muffled voice, the unmistakable sound of flesh meeting flesh. He rounded the corner and saw a man pressed against the brick wall of a closed shop, an older black woman pinned beneath his grip, her face twisted in fear. Marcus moved without thinking, his hand wrapped around the man's wrist, twisting it hard, a sickening crack cutting through the air as the man yelped, stumbling back. The woman staggered away, gasping, and Marcus stepped between them, his eyes locked onto his target. The man was younger, maybe mid-30s, lean but wiry, with a shaved head and a tattoo peeking from beneath the collar of his jacket. He cradled his broken wrist against his chest, spitting at Marcus's feet. "Ain't your business." Marcus didn't speak, just waited. The man sneered, eyes flicking to the woman. "She shouldn't be here, no way. None of you should." Marcus didn't blink. "And why's that?" The man's lips curled, his face ugly with hate. "This ain't your people's country. Ain't never been. It was a mistake letting them get this far. But don't worry." He grinned, despite the pain in his wrist. "We're gonna fix it real soon." Marcus stepped closer, slow, deliberate, until the man had to tilt his head to look him in the eyes. "Is that right?" The man didn't flinch. "Yeah. And you?" His grin widened, teeth stained yellow. "You don't belong here either." Marcus exhaled, slow, controlled. Then he grabbed the man's shattered wrist and twisted, hard. The scream was instant. The man dropped to his knees, gasping for air, his free hand slapping against the ground. Marcus crouched beside him, voice cold. "You come for my people in my town and see what happens." The man whimpered, nodding rapidly. Marcus released him, standing back to his full height. The man scrambled away, clutching his arm, disappearing into the night. Marcus turned to the woman, his voice softer now. "You all right?" She nodded shakily. "Thank you." Marcus watched the woman disappear down the street, her hurried footsteps fading into the night, the fear still clinging to her despite her relief at escaping. She had been shaken, but not broken. Another reminder that Haven's Rest was filled with people who had survived too much to be easily shattered. But survival wasn't enough. Not this time. He turned, his mind already shifting gears, replaying every word the man had spat at him. Something was coming. That much was clear, and it wouldn't be like the quiet terror they'd used before. No more broken windows in the dead of night. No more veiled threats left on doorsteps. This was going to be open, violent, final. Marcus clenched his jaw as he moved, slipping through the back alleys, taking the longer route home, always aware of his surroundings. Old habits, the kind that never really left you. The same instincts that had kept him alive in war zones across the world now guided his every step through the streets of his own home. By the time he reached his house, the others were already inside, waiting. The place was nothing special, just a modest, two-story home sitting at the edge of town, like everything else in Haven's Rest, built with care, meant to last. But tonight, it wasn't just a house. It was a war room. Darius was near the window, rifle across his lap, gaze locked on the street outside. He had always been the watcher, the one who saw the threat before anyone else did, the one who could sense a fight before it started. Leon sat near the kitchen, hands on his knees, his posture loose. But Marcus knew him well enough to recognize the tension beneath the surface. Samuel stood near the dining table, arms crossed. Quiet, as always. But his silence wasn't hesitation. It was focus. Marcus closed the door behind him and exhaled, shaking his head. It's worse than we thought. Darius finally looked away from the window. How bad? Marcus moved toward the table, pulling out a chair but not sitting, hands braced against the wood as he let the words settle before speaking. They're not just burning businesses anymore, he said, his voice even, but carrying the weight of what he had seen. They're hunting now, and they're getting ready for something big. Leon exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. That woman you saved, she say anything? Marcus shook his head. Didn't need to. The man who had her, he told me all I needed to know. Samuel narrowed his eyes slightly. He talk? Not the way we'd want him to, Marcus admitted. But he didn't have to. Something's coming. Soon. And when it does, it won't be a handful of men breaking windows. It'll be all of them, coming to take everything. Darius leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers tapping lightly against his rifle. Then we don't wait for them to make the first move. Marcus nodded. Exactly. They had fought wars before, seen battlefields across the world, but this was different. This was home, and that meant one thing. They had no intention of losing. Leon cracked his knuckles. All right, so, what's the plan? Marcus glanced around the room, at the men who had fought beside him in places most Americans would never hear about, at the men who had bled for each other, who had survived the worst the world had to offer. And now, they were about to fight again. But this time, they weren't fighting for a government that saw them as expendable. They were fighting for their town, their people, their history. Marcus exhaled, his voice steady. We make sure they never get the chance to take Haven's Rest. We hit first. We set the battlefield. And when they come, his eyes hardened. We make damn sure they never leave. The silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was absolute acceptance. Samuel finally nodded. Then, let's get to work. Haven's Rest was a quiet town, but that didn't mean it wasn't strong. People had always underestimated it. The Blooded Sons had made that mistake when they thought the town would roll over and accept its fate. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. That night, the Seals split up, moving through the town like ghosts in the dark. Darius scouted vantage points, marking the best rooftops for sniper nests, the alleys that could serve as ambush sites, the roads that could be turned into kill zones. Leon worked with a few trusted locals, setting up explosives. Not enough to level buildings, but enough to send a clear message. Samuel gathered supplies, working with the town's few hunters and ex-military men, teaching them how to handle themselves when the bullets started flying. Marcus met with Mayor Sarah Carter, laying it all out. "This is going to get ugly," he told her. "You need to make sure the people who can't fight are ready to get out if they have to." She had nodded, jaw tight. "We're not running," she had said, "but I'll do what needs to be done." By dawn, Haven's Rest wasn't just a town anymore. It was a fortress, and when the Blooded Sons came for it, they wouldn't find prey. They'd find warriors. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that sat thick in the air just before a storm. Haven's Rest had always been quiet at this hour. Porch lights flickering, dogs barking in the distance, the occasional hum of a truck rolling down the old roads. But tonight, the silence wasn't peace. It was something else entirely. It was anticipation. Marcus knelt on the rooftop of a two-story building at the edge of town, his rifle balanced against the ledge, eyes locked on the main road leading into Haven's Rest. Below him, the town was asleep. Or at least, it would appear that way to anyone who didn't know better. The houses were dark, the streets empty, but behind those locked doors and shuttered windows, there were people waiting, armed, ready. The Blooded Sons thought they were coming for easy prey. They had no idea they were walking into a battlefield. His earpiece crackled with Darius's low voice. "Movement! 6, maybe 7 trucks. 2 vans behind them, heavily armed." Marcus exhaled slowly. They were coming in like they were running a military operation, the way men who had never actually been to war played at being soldiers. He had seen it before. Men who thought rifles and numbers made them strong. Men who had never once faced something they truly feared. They were about to learn. Leon's voice followed over the comms, calm and steady. "Boomers in position. Traps are live." Samuel's voice came next. "Medical teams prepped. Let's try not to need 'em." Marcus tapped his radio once in acknowledgement, then went still, waiting. The convoy rumbled into town, headlights flooding the street in stark white beams, engines roaring like they owned the place. He could hear the shouts of men hyping themselves up, laughing, talking like this was all some game, a hunting trip where the prey had nowhere to run. Marcus shifted slightly, adjusting his rifle, focusing the scope. He wasn't aiming for the grunts. Not yet. He was looking for leadership, for the man who had pulled this together, for the one whose fall would make the others stumble. And then he saw him, standing in the back of a lifted black truck, dressed in fatigues that didn't belong to him, his hands resting on the edge of the cab like some self-proclaimed general surveying his conquest. The leader. Even without hearing his voice, Marcus recognized the type. Arrogant, self-assured, a man who didn't fight his own battles, who surrounded himself with men willing to kill and die for an ideology they barely understood. A man who thought he was untouchable. He wasn't. The trucks slowed as they neared the center of town, and the men inside started spreading out, stepping onto the streets like they were stretching their legs, like they were already picturing what would burn first. And then the first explosion hit. A deafening boom erupted from beneath the lead truck, flipping it onto its side in a shower of fire and metal. The force of the blast sent men sprawling, some screaming, some silent in the wake of the sudden destruction. Panic set in immediately. The ones who had been standing in the truck beds jumped down, rifles raised, eyes darting wildly in the darkness. Marcus pulled the trigger. The shot was clean, silent, and deadly, and the man nearest the fallen truck dropped before he even realized he had been hit. Darius followed an instant later, his rifle singing from the rooftop across the street, another body falling in the chaos. The gang had been loud before, now they were silent. For the first time, they understood that they were being hunted. Shouts rang out, men calling to each other, struggling to organize, trying to find an enemy they couldn't see. One of them fired wildly into the dark, the muzzle flash giving away his position, and Leon sent a second blast tearing through the street. Another truck ignited, flames licking high into the night, smoke curling into the air like a signal of death. More shots, more screams. The Blooded Sons had numbers, but they were fighting ghosts. And then, amid the chaos, Marcus saw him running. The leader, the man who had stood tall when they first arrived, confident and untouchable, was now ducking low, moving fast, trying to slip away unnoticed while his men fought and died in the street. Marcus moved. He descended from the rooftop with practiced ease, his boots hitting the ground in silence, his body blending into the shadows as he cut through the alleyways, closing the distance. The gang leader, whoever he was, whatever name he had given himself to justify his place in this war, was fast, but he wasn't fast enough. Marcus caught up just as he reached the outskirts, grabbing him by the back of his jacket and yanking him hard. The man barely had time to gasp before Marcus slammed him into the brick wall of a closed storefront, his forearm pressing hard against his throat. For the first time that night, Marcus got a clear look at him. He was young, younger than he expected, maybe early 30s, white, sharp-jawed, with the lean build of someone who had spent more time barking orders than taking hits. His eyes were bright with panic, his mouth twisting into something between a sneer and a plea. Marcus didn't speak. He just pressed harder, forcing a choked gasp from the man's lips. "You want to tell me who you are?" Marcus asked, his voice calm, almost casual. "Or do I have to start pulling answers out of you the hard way?" The man struggled, hands grasping at Marcus's arm, but he wasn't strong enough to break free. "You don't know what you're doing," he rasped, his breath hitching. "You think this ends tonight? You think this town's gonna survive? There's more coming. More men, more fire. You think you—" Marcus cut him off by slamming his head back against the brick. Not hard enough to kill, but enough to make his vision blur. "That's real nice," Marcus murmured, "but you're not in charge anymore." He pulled a zip tie from his belt and secured the man's wrists behind his back, yanking him forward, forcing him to move. The battle was over. The gang was retreating. Whatever illusion of strength they had arrived with had been shattered. Their men were dead, their trucks were burning, their leader was in chains. The blooded sons had come to Haven's Rest, thinking they would erase it. Instead, they had been the ones wiped out. Marcus led the captured man through the empty streets, stepping over bodies, past the remnants of a fight that had never been fair, a battle that had been decided before it even started. Darius's voice crackled over the radio. "They're running!" Leon followed a second later. "What about their leader?" Marcus tightened his grip on the man's collar, dragging him forward. "We got him." The gang had come expecting to conquer. Now they were nothing but the first warning. They wouldn't be the last, but it didn't matter. Haven's Rest was ready. The sky had barely begun to lighten when Marcus shoved the bound man into an empty storeroom near the town center, a converted supply space behind the old barber shop, its walls lined with wooden crates and rusted shelves stacked with tools and discarded hardware. The gang leader stumbled, landing hard on his knees, his breath hitching as he twisted to glare at them, his eyes sharp despite the bruising already forming along the side of his face. Leon shut the door behind them, locking it with a deliberate click, and the air in the room seemed to shrink, the space closing in on the man who had, just hours ago, arrived in Haven's Rest with every intention of burning it to the ground. Now, with his hands zip-tied behind his back, the blood of his men still drying in the streets outside, he looked less like a leader and more like a man who had just realized he'd made the last mistake of his life. Marcus crouched in front of him, forearms resting on his knees, his expression unreadable. "Name." The man shifted, jaw clenching, the muscles in his neck tightening against the restraint. "Go to hell." Marcus exhaled slowly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the knife he always carried, flipping it open with an ease that didn't feel like a threat, because it wasn't. It was a promise. He set the blade against the man's thigh, not pressing down, just letting the weight of it settle there, the sharp edge resting against fabric that was one twist away from cutting into flesh. "You already got one foot in it," Marcus murmured. "You sure you want to keep running your mouth?" The man swallowed, eyes flicking between Marcus and the others. Darius stood near the back wall, arms crossed, silent, his gaze heavy, unreadable. Samuel leaned against a crate, hands resting loosely at his sides, but there was something coiled in the way he stood, like a blade waiting to be drawn. Leon, closest to the door, let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Let's get one thing straight," Leon said, voice low, almost conversational. "You're not walking out of here unless we let you. You understand that, right?" The man's lips twisted into something that might have been a sneer, but there was fear behind it, a crack in the arrogance he had carried when he arrived. "You think this ends with me?" he spat. "You think you stopped something? You don't even know what you just started." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "So why don't you tell me?" The man exhaled sharply, licking his split lip, shifting his weight like he was considering his options. Then he laughed, a rough, bitter sound. "More are coming. You think you made a stand tonight? You think you proved something? All you did was light the fire." His breath hitched slightly, but he recovered quickly, leveling his gaze at Marcus. "They're already on their way." Darius pushed off the wall, his voice quiet but edged with something lethal. "How many?" The man smirked. "Enough." Marcus didn't react. He let the silence stretch between them, let the weight of the moment settle over the man like a noose tightening around his neck. Then he stood, flipping the knife closed with a flick of his wrist, tucking it back into his pocket. "You know what the difference is between you and me?" he asked, voice calm, even. The man didn't answer, but Marcus could see the way his shoulders tensed, the way his body braced like he was waiting for the hit to come. "I know what war actually looks like," Marcus continued. "You play at it, dress yourself up in stolen valor, tell yourself you're fighting for something real, but you don't even know what that means." He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. "Your people are dead. The ones who made it out are running scared. And the men you're waiting for?" His gaze darkened. "By the time they get here, they won't be finding a town to take. They'll be walking into a graveyard." The man's smirk faltered, just slightly. Leon sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "What do we do with him?" Marcus stared at the man for a long moment, then turned away, stepping toward the door. "Lock him up, somewhere he can think about his choices." He paused just before exiting. "We've got bigger things to handle." Outside, the town was waking up. The fires from the night's battle had been smothered. The wreckage of the gang's failed assault still scattered across the streets, bullet casings and blood staining the pavement. People had gathered, their faces tight with exhaustion, with fear, but also with something else, something harder. Marcus stepped out, feeling the weight of 100 eyes turned toward him. "Marcus!" Mayor Carter called, her voice steady, but her expression edged with tension. "People are scared. They need to know what the hell just happened." He nodded once, stepping forward, letting the crowd see him, letting them see all of them. 4 men who had stood between their home and the men who had come to destroy it. "Some of you already know," Marcus started, voice low but carrying across the street. "Some of you heard the gunfire. Some of you saw the bodies." He let that settle before continuing. "They came here tonight thinking they could take what they wanted. They came here to burn this town, to erase everything your families built, to make sure there was nothing left." A murmur ran through the crowd, anger bleeding into the fear, people shifting, fists clenching, heads shaking, but they didn't win. Marcus continued, "Because Haven's Rest isn't just a town, it's a home, and the only way they'll take it is over our dead bodies." He let his gaze sweep over them. "They aren't done. They're coming back, and we need to be ready." A voice rose from the crowd, a man in his late 60s, his face lined with years of labor, of struggle. "Ready how?" Marcus nodded toward Darius. "We'll teach you." Leon stepped forward. "Some of you already know how to shoot. The rest of you, you're gonna learn." Samuel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not just about guns. It's about knowing how to survive, how to move, how to fight smart." Mayor Carter took a step forward, facing the crowd. "If you want to leave, no one will stop you. But for those of you who are staying, we stand together." The murmurs grew louder, people shifting, looking at one another, gauging the moment, the weight of it. And then, one by one, heads nodded. Men, women, young, old. Haven's Rest wasn't just scared anymore. They were angry. An older woman near the front, her voice strong despite the tremble in her hands, lifted her chin. Tell us what we need to do." Marcus exhaled slowly, nodding. This wasn't just their fight anymore. It belonged to all of them. And when the Blooded Sons returned, they wouldn't be facing a handful of men. They'd be facing a town that refused to fall. The night air was thick with the smell of burned rubber and gunpowder, a lingering reminder of the battle that had torn through Haven's Rest only hours before. The town was quiet now, the kind of silence that came after the storm, but Marcus knew better than to believe it was over. This was just the beginning. The four of them sat around his kitchen table, the only light coming from a dim overhead bulb that flickered slightly, casting shadows across their faces. They had been here before, in other places, other wars, late-night debriefs after firefights, strategizing, adjusting, preparing for the next inevitable wave. Leon leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand down his face before exhaling. "All right, let's talk about it. We know this ain't over. The question is, how bad is it gonna get?" Marcus tapped his fingers against the wood, his mind already sorting through the possibilities. "Bad," he said finally, voice steady, measured. "Worse than tonight. We hit them hard, harder than they expected. They're not gonna take that lightly." Darius, who had been silent up until now, shifted slightly, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. They came in expecting no resistance. They thought they'd roll in, put on a little show of force, scare the town into submission. But they didn't plan for us. They didn't expect this place to fight back. Leon scoffed. Hell, even some of the folks here didn't expect to fight back. But they did. And now that they've seen what we can do, they're in this. He ran a hand along the back of his neck, his brow furrowed. But the problem is, that's gonna piss the wrong people off. Samuel, who had been quietly watching them all, finally spoke, his voice calm but heavy. "We need to talk about him." He tilted his head toward the back room, where their captured prisoner was still locked up. "That man led them in here. He thought he was in charge. But if that was the case, then this whole operation was sloppy. Too sloppy. He was reckless, arrogant. He walked in here like he already owned the place, but he didn't plan for anything. That doesn't feel like leadership to me." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's been sitting with me too. He didn't act like a man with real power. He was loud. He wanted to be seen. The real ones? The ones actually running things? They don't operate like that. They don't throw themselves into the fight. They move the pieces from a distance." Darius' fingers drummed lightly against the table, his eyes narrowing slightly. "So you think he was just a field leader, a unit commander, not the one actually pulling the strings?" Leon exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Makes sense. But that begs the question. If he wasn't the real leader, then who the hell is? And how far does this go?" Samuel leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "We know the name the Blooded Sons. But groups like this, they don't just spring up overnight. Someone built them, funded them. Someone fed them their ideology, trained them, gave them weapons, a purpose. The way they moved, the way they tried to take this town, that wasn't random violence. That was planned, coordinated, which means someone out there is thinking 10 steps ahead." Marcus stared at the table for a long moment before speaking. "If that's true, then we need to figure out who it is. Fast. Because they're not done with us. We embarrassed them tonight. And if there's someone higher up, someone with real pull, they're not gonna let this go." Darius exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw. "They're already regrouping. We need to assume that, because anything else would be naive. The question is, how much time do we have?" Leon leaned back again, arms crossed. "Not enough. We crippled their first wave, but that just means the next one is gonna come heavier. They'll bring reinforcements, more men, more firepower, probably outside help too. Militias, mercenaries, cops who sympathize with their cause. Hell, maybe all of the above." Marcus nodded. "That's what I'm thinking too. And if they're smart, they won't come at us the same way twice. This time, they'll send scouts ahead, test our defenses, Pick off weak points before committing to a full assault. Samuel's expression was unreadable, but there was something dark behind his eyes, which means the town needs to be ready, not just a few people. Everyone. The ones who picked up a rifle tonight, they were acting on adrenaline. But the next time, they need to act on instinct. That means training. That means strategy. That means knowing how to survive. Darius exhaled, rubbing his palms together slowly, thoughtfully. We need to make Haven's Rest something they can't take. Something too costly to even try. Leon shook his head. We already showed them we're willing to fight, but now we gotta make them afraid to fight us. Marcus ran a hand over his beard, thinking. We use their arrogance against them. They think they're stronger than us. We make them question that. We make them hesitate. That's how we survive this. If they think attacking means they die, they'll start second-guessing. And second-guessing gets men killed. Samuel tilted his head. And what about the prisoner? What's his role in this? Marcus exhaled slowly. We let him sit for a while. Let him think about what just happened. Then we put him to use. Darius's eyes darkened slightly. Interrogation? Marcus met his gaze. Something like that. He wants to act like a soldier? We'll see how long that lasts when he's alone, when there's no men at his back, no numbers to make him feel powerful. Eventually, he'll break. They always do. Leon smirked slightly. And if he doesn't? Marcus stood, rolling his shoulders. Then we keep moving. With or without him, we already know what we need to do. We train the town. We reinforce every weak spot. We turn this place into a fortress. And we make sure that when they come back, we bury every last one of them. Silence settled over the table, but it wasn't uncertainty. It was resolve. This wasn't a fight they had asked for, but it was a fight they would win. The first sign came at dawn. A single set of tire tracks cut deep into the dirt road leading toward the highway, fresh enough that Marcus knew they hadn't been there the night before. Someone had come in the dead of night, watching, scouting, marking the town for what was coming next. By noon, a drone buzzed high above Haven's Rest, circling lazily, its presence a quiet confirmation that the enemy was planning their next move. And by sunset, Marcus stood at the edge of town, staring at a distant line of headlights stretching across the horizon. They were coming. He turned back toward the main street, where the people of Haven's Rest had gathered, their faces lined with exhaustion, but not with fear. Not anymore. They had spent the last 2 days preparing, turning homes into bunkers, reinforcing windows and doors, setting up supply caches. The ones who could fight had trained relentlessly, learning to move, to shoot, to defend. The ones who couldn't had been moved to safer ground, tucked away in basements and hidden rooms, waiting for the storm to pass. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was war. Darius approached, rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes tracking the growing lights in the distance. They're coming in force. Marcus nodded. How long? Maybe an hour, maybe less. Leon let out a slow exhale, adjusting the straps on his vest. They're smarter this time. They're taking their time, making sure we see them coming. They want us to feel the weight of it before they hit. Samuel stepped up beside them, his expression unreadable. Let them. Won't change a damn thing. Marcus turned back to the crowd, scanning the faces of the men and women who had chosen to stand and fight. They weren't soldiers, but they were something more dangerous. People with something to lose. You all know what's coming, Marcus said, his voice steady, even. You know why they're here. They think they can take this place because they don't believe we belong here. They want to burn it, erase it, wipe it off the map like it never existed. He let the words settle, watching the anger flicker across their faces. They're wrong. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a slow building fire. Quiet, but certain. They'll come hard, Marcus continued. They'll hit us with everything they have. But we've spent the last 2 days making sure that when they do, they'll find nothing but hell waiting for them. He looked toward Darius, who gave a slight nod before stepping forward. Sniper teams are in position. We've got eyes on every approach, covering every angle. They won't move without us seeing them. Leon followed. Explosives are set. They roll too far in, They lose their wheels. They push through anyway. They lose their men. Samuel's voice was calm, assured. Medical stations are ready. We don't leave anyone behind. The town had no applause, no cheers, just grim determination. They weren't here to celebrate. They were here to survive. Marcus turned back toward the road. Positions. Now. They moved quickly, without hesitation, disappearing into the buildings, onto rooftops, behind cover. The town went silent. Then, in the distance, the first shot rang out. A single bullet, fired from one of Darius's snipers, punching through the windshield of a speeding truck. The driver's head snapped back, the vehicle veering wildly before crashing into the ditch, its tires still spinning. And then, all at once, the night exploded into chaos. Engines roared as the convoy surged forward, headlights cutting through the darkness, gunfire erupting from both sides. The Blooded Sons weren't testing the waters anymore. They were diving in head first, throwing everything they had into the fight. Marcus dropped behind cover, raising his rifle as the first wave came barreling through. He took his shots carefully, efficiently, dropping men before they could reach cover, before they could orient themselves. From the rooftops, Darius and his snipers moved like ghosts, picking off enemies one by one, bodies dropping before anyone could even locate the source of the shots. Then, the first explosion hit. Leon's traps ignited beneath the lead vehicles, fire and shrapnel ripping through steel and flesh alike. The impact sent bodies flying, scattering their forces before they could push deeper into town. The first wave was already collapsing, their assault thrown into disarray. But it wasn't enough to stop them. More trucks came, swerving around the wreckage, men spilling out, using the burning vehicles for cover. They were learning, adapting, moving faster than the first wave. They weren't retreating. They were here to finish what they started. Marcus ducked back behind cover as a burst of gunfire shredded the wood near his head, sending splinters into the air. He tapped his radio. They're pushing left flank. Cut 'em off before they regroup. Already on it, Darius's voice came through, followed by another sharp crack of a rifle. To the right, Samuel was leading a small team through the alleyways, moving fast, covering angles, keeping the fight fluid. They didn't let the enemy dig in, didn't let them gain a foothold. But even as they cut them down, more kept coming. This was a siege. This wasn't just one raid, one battle. This was an attempt to break them, to wear them down, to push them into submission through sheer force. And it was only the beginning. Gunfire tore through the night, bullets ricocheting off brick and steel, the sharp crack of rifles and the low, guttural bursts of automatic fire blending into a violent symphony. The air smelled of smoke and sweat, thick with the acrid burn of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Marcus moved through the chaos like a predator, every step measured, every breath steady, his rifle raised as he scanned the battlefield. The town was holding, but barely. The Blooded Sons weren't breaking like the first time. They weren't retreating in fear. They had come prepared. He ducked into an alley as a burst of gunfire shredded the wooden crates beside him, splinters flying past his face. He twisted, pressing his back against the brick wall, heart pounding but mind cold and calculating. They were pushing deeper now, bypassing the main streets, breaking into homes, targeting civilians. His radio crackled with Darius's voice. They're in the residential areas. They're not just trying to kill fighters. They're hunting families. A slow burn of rage settled in Marcus's chest, deep and cold. Keep them moving. Don't let them get comfortable. Got it, Darius responded, followed by the distant sharp crack of his rifle. Marcus pushed off the wall and moved, cutting through a side street, his boots light on the pavement, his mind already 2 steps ahead. The enemy was trying to spread them thin, force them to defend every street, every home, every doorway. It was smart, ruthless, designed to overwhelm. But they had made one mistake. They thought they could win through brutality alone. Marcus stepped into the next street, just as 3 Blooded Sons dragged a man from his house, his wife screaming, their young daughter clutching the doorframe, eyes wide with terror. Marcus didn't hesitate. He dropped the first man with a precise shot to the head, the rifle kicking against his shoulder as the second man spun, eyes widening. He didn't get the chance to react before Marcus was already moving, closing the distance, dropping the rifle in favor of something more personal. The second man swung first, sloppy, wild, too much adrenaline and not enough skill. Marcus slipped past the punch, caught his wrist, and twisted hard, sending the man crashing into the wall. The third attacker lunged with a knife, blade flashing under the dim streetlights, but Marcus redirected the momentum, slamming an elbow into the man's throat, cutting off his air before driving his knee into his ribs hard enough to hear something crack. The second man staggered forward again, recovered faster than expected, but Marcus was already waiting. He stepped into him, hooking an arm around his neck, twisting, cutting off circulation. The man thrashed for a second, choking, fingers clawing at Marcus's arm, but his movements slowed as his body lost oxygen. Marcus let him drop, unconscious, before turning to the last man still gasping on the ground. The man coughed, clutching his side, eyes filled with pain and confusion. He had thought this was going to be easy, thought he was part of something bigger, something unstoppable. Now he was bleeding in the dirt, realizing just how wrong he had been. Marcus crouched beside him, his voice calm. "You came here thinking you were going to wipe this place out, that you were the one with power. Look around." He gestured toward the town where his people were still standing, still fighting, still refusing to break. "You were wrong." The man spat blood, muttering something Marcus didn't bother listening to. He struck him hard across the temple, just enough to knock him out, just enough to remind him that this wasn't his world anymore. The man inside the house stumbled forward, eyes wide with disbelief. Thank you, get inside," Marcus ordered. "Lock your doors. Stay low. This isn't over yet." The man nodded, rushing back to his family, dragging his wife and daughter inside before sealing the door shut. Marcus retrieved his rifle, tapping his radio. "More of them are targeting homes. We need to pull them back to the main streets before this turns into a massacre." Leon's voice came through, tense but controlled. "On it." "Got some surprises waiting for them if they try to push through the old market district." Marcus moved again, cutting through the alley, stepping over bodies, past fires burning low in the streets, smoke curling into the air. He could hear the faint, rhythmic thump of approaching vehicles, more of them, circling back, trying to reinforce their failing assault. Then he saw him, the man standing near the wreckage of a burned-out truck, watching. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't calling orders. He was studying, calculating. Marcus knew immediately. This was the real leader. This was the one who had sent the first wave to die, the one who had waited to see what kind of resistance they were dealing with. He wasn't a grunt. He wasn't just another angry man with a gun. He was the kind of enemy who knew how to win wars, and he was already planning his next move. Marcus didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, sighted in, pulled the trigger. The leader moved at the last second. Fast. Too fast. The bullet grazed his shoulder instead of tearing through his chest, sending him staggering back. But he didn't panic. He turned, locked eyes with Marcus, and smirked. Then, before Marcus could fire again, he disappeared into the shadows. The fight was far from over. It had only just begun. The streets of Haven's Rest were chaos, burning with the echoes of gunfire and the sharp sounds of combat. The blooded suns had not scattered like last time. They had come back with discipline, organization, and the kind of calculated aggression that meant someone had taught them how to fight. This was no longer a wild, undirected attack. This was war. Marcus moved quickly through the battlefield, keeping low, weaving between the wreckage of burning trucks, dodging between the cover of bullet-riddled buildings as he closed in on his team. His rifle was low, but he could already tell by the shifting momentum of the fight that it was time to go hand to hand. Darius and Leon were holding a defensive line near the broken-down shell of an old hardware store, their rifles still hot, their backs against a battered wall. Samuel had been further ahead, fighting off an encroaching group of men near a boarded-up church. They had been holding their ground, but Marcus could see the shift happening. The blooded sons were pushing harder, fighting smarter, moving like men who had learned from their first defeat and had no intention of being humiliated again. He sprinted toward his team, sliding to a stop behind cover, breathing steady despite the intensity of the battle. "Close combat," he said, his voice low but firm, eyes flicking between his brothers. "They're adapting." Leon exhaled sharply, adjusting the grip on his rifle. "Yeah, we noticed." Darius nodded toward the advancing forces, his jaw tight. "They're not running scared this time. They're using cover, trying to pin us down, moving like they know what the hell they're doing." Samuel wiped blood from his lip, his expression unreadable. "That's because they do. These aren't just some weekend warrior racists anymore. Someone trained them." Marcus set his rifle against the wall and pulled his combat knife from its sheath. "Then we take the fight to them." The shift was instant. The SEALs moved together, fluid, precise, dropping their rifles in favor of something more primal. This wasn't a battle fought at a distance anymore. This was a street fight. Marcus was the first to move, stepping out into the open, closing the distance to the first enemy before the man could raise his weapon. His knife flashed, sharp and fast, a single brutal slash cutting across the man's wrist before Marcus drove his fist into his throat, silencing his scream before it could even form. Darius followed immediately after, his boot slamming into another attacker's knee, sending the man crashing down before he twisted his arm behind his back and snapped it clean at the joint. The man howled, but Darius didn't let him suffer long, driving his elbow into his skull with enough force to put him out cold. Leon caught a swinging pipe mid-air, twisting his opponent's wrist hard enough that the weapon dropped, then stepped in, grabbing the man by the collar and slamming his head against the hood of a burning truck. Samuel was pure efficiency, weaving through attacks like a man who had spent his life dodging death. He caught a wild punch, redirected the force, and countered with a brutal strike to the ribs, following up with a sharp elbow to the face that left his opponent sprawling. They moved like a single, devastating force. Every attack was methodical, every strike measured, breaking bones, crushing throats, putting men down before they had a chance to recover. The blooded sons had come expecting to dominate, but now they were facing something they had never encountered before. Trained killers who knew exactly how to dismantle them. And then he arrived. Marcus felt it before he saw it. The shift in the fight. The moment when something darker, heavier, settled into the air. A new presence. The real leader. The man stepped into view like he owned the battlefield, moving with the kind of controlled violence that only came from years of experience. He wasn't some loud-mouthed fanatic barking orders from the sidelines. He was a soldier, and he carried himself like one. The blooded sons had never had a leader before, not a real one, not like this. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face lined by years of combat, his jaw tight, his stance relaxed, but coiled like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His eyes were cold, unreadable, taking in the fight like it was nothing more than a puzzle to be solved. Marcus didn't need an introduction. He knew immediately. This was the real enemy. The man's gaze swept the battlefield before locking onto Samuel. And then he moved. Fast, brutal, precise. Before Samuel could react, the leader was on him, stepping in close, twisting his body with lethal efficiency, slamming an elbow into Samuel's ribs hard enough to crack something. Samuel grunted, but didn't fall, countering with a sharp jab, quick and controlled. But the leader absorbed it, rolled with it, retaliated with a vicious knee to the stomach that sent Samuel staggering back. Marcus saw the shift. Samuel was a fighter, but this man was something different. He was a killer. The leader didn't stop. He was relentless, pressing forward, slamming a fist into Samuel's jaw, then catching him mid-fall, yanking him back up just to drive another brutal punch into his ribs. Samuel's breath hitched, pain flashing across his face, but he gritted his teeth and swung, aiming for the man's throat. The leader dodged, effortlessly, and then he drove his fist into Samuel's gut so hard that Samuel collapsed to his knees, coughing blood. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. This man wasn't just strong. He was to them what they were to the blooded sons. A ghost. A predator. Samuel tried to push himself up, but the leader grabbed him by the collar, yanking him up like he weighed nothing. And then, with no hesitation, he slammed Samuel's face against the side of a car, the impact ringing out like a gunshot. Rage burned through Marcus like wildfire. Leon moved first, stepping forward, but Marcus stopped him with a sharp look. "This one's mine," Marcus said, his voice low, dangerous. The leader turned, dropping Samuel to the ground like he was nothing, his eyes meeting Marcus's with an amused smirk. Marcus didn't speak. He just stepped forward, rolling his shoulders, his hands curling into fists, and prepared to end this. The battlefield had gone eerily still. Fires crackled in the distance, sending thick, curling smoke into the air. But the gunfire had slowed, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension that settled over Haven's Rest like a funeral shroud. Bodies lay scattered across the streets, some groaning, clutching wounds, others unmoving. The blooded sons had stopped their charge, retreating to regroup, their once assured confidence shaken by the brutal resistance they had encountered. But they had not fled, because they still had an ace to play. Marcus stood across from the leader, his stance steady, fists still clenched. But he didn't move. Not yet. He was watching, waiting, calculating, because something had shifted in the air. Something worse than gunfire. Worse than the brutality they had already seen. The leader stood before him, composed, unshaken by the destruction around them. His lip was split from the brief exchange with Samuel, but there was no anger in his expression. Only amusement. That was what made Marcus's skin crawl. He had met killers before. Men who fought for causes they barely understood. Men who thrived on chaos and fear. But this man was different. This was someone who had seen war and learned to enjoy it. "You fight well," the leader said, his voice calm, edged with something dark, something cold. "Better than I expected, and trust me, I expected a lot." Marcus didn't respond. He could feel Leon and Darius behind him, could hear Samuel groaning as he pushed himself up from the ground, blood dripping from his face. But Marcus kept his focus locked on the man in front of him, because something wasn't right. "You think you won something tonight?" The leader exhaled slowly, stretching his shoulders, rolling his neck like he was shaking off the fight, like he still had control. "You didn't. This was never about burning down your little town. Not really. That was just the beginning." Marcus remained silent, his breathing slow, steady. The leader smirked slightly, wiping blood from his mouth. "I did my homework, Kane. I know exactly who you are. I know what you are." He gestured vaguely. "All of you? Really? You think you're special? You think you're different from me?" Leon let out a sharp breath. "Ain't a single man in this town like you." The leader's smirk widened slightly. "See? That's where you're wrong. I know men like you. Hell, I've fought beside men like you. You're killers, all of you. You've just convinced yourselves that your cause is different. You don't know a damn thing about us," Darius said, his voice quiet but sharp, his fingers twitching near his belt, his body tense, ready. "I know more than you think," the leader mused, watching them, studying them the way a predator studied prey. Then his gaze flicked over Marcus's shoulder, and his smirk deepened. "But you're right. This isn't about you. Not anymore." Marcus stiffened. That feeling, that creeping sense that something was wrong, that something had been missing, suddenly clicked into place. And then he heard it, the sound of movement. Footsteps. Bodies being shoved forward. Muffled cries. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the figures emerging from the smoke behind the blooded suns, and the ice in his veins hardened into something lethal. They weren't soldiers. They weren't fighters. They were hostages. A group of black men and women, some younger, some elderly, their faces streaked with dirt, their eyes wide with panic. They had been pulled from their homes, dragged from the outskirts in the chaos of the battle, held at gunpoint by men who had planned this from the start. The blooded sons hadn't just come to take the town. They had come to take people. Marcus's jaw tightened, his mind racing through possibilities, through contingencies, through every possible way this could play out. This was different. This changed everything. "That's more like it," the leader murmured, watching the realization settle over them. "That's the look I was waiting for." Samuel wiped blood from his mouth, his eyes dark with fury. "You think this is gonna save you?" The leader chuckled. "Save me? No, I don't need saving." He gestured toward the hostages. "They do." Marcus exhaled slowly, forcing himself to breathe, to stay controlled, to stay sharp. "Let them go," he said, his voice carefully neutral. The leader raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "Now why would I do that?" Darius's grip tightened on his weapon. "Because if you don't leave here alive." The leader smiled. "I was under the impression that was already the case. But see, I know something you don't. You don't have a choice here. You think you do. You think because you've held off my men that you're in control. But you're not. You never were." The hostages whimpered as the men holding them tightened their grips, guns pressing into backs and temples, fingers hovering over triggers. The air felt like glass about to shatter. "You see," the leader continued, his voice smooth, measured, as if he were discussing something far less sinister, "I understand how this works. You fight for something. That's what makes you dangerous, but it also makes you predictable, because now I have something you don't." He tilted his head. "Now I have leverage." Leon took a step forward, his body coiled like a spring. "You got a real twisted sense of how this ends." The leader exhaled through his nose, almost like he was disappointed. "It ends the way I decide it ends." He glanced back at the hostages before returning his gaze to Marcus. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to put down your weapons. You're going to tell your people to stand down. And if you do that, I'll be generous." He smiled. "I'll let them live." A long, heavy silence followed. Marcus could feel all of it. The weight of the moment, the unbearable tension pressing in from every direction, the standoff that could end in a second, with nothing more than a single wrong move. The blooded sons had done their damage. They had lost more men than they had expected, had been forced to retreat, but they had prepared for this. They had known they might lose the battle, so they had planned for something worse. They had taken people. Marcus kept his expression unreadable, his body perfectly still, his mind moving too fast to track. If he gave the order to drop weapons, the town was lost. If he called the leader's bluff, the hostages might die. There was no right answer, and the leader knew it. "You're stalling," the leader said finally, his smirk fading slightly. "That's cute, but it's also a waste of time. So make the call, Kane, right now, or I start putting bullets in skulls." The wind shifted, smoke curling through the street, and for the first time all night, Marcus wasn't sure how this was going to end. The air was thick with smoke, tension hanging so heavy that it felt like the entire town was holding its breath. The hostages stood in a tight cluster, hands bound, faces streaked with sweat and fear, their wide eyes darting between Marcus and the blooded sons. The leader stood at the center of it all, his expression calm, collected, because he thought he had already won. "You know," the leader said, voice measured, conversational, almost bored, "I've always wondered what it is that makes you people think you own something." He gestured around them, to the streets, the buildings, the town that had stood defiant against him. "You really believe this place belongs to you? That you built it? That you deserve to keep it?" A few of the hostages flinched. Others just bowed their heads, their bodies tense. The gang members standing beside them smirked, emboldened by their leader's words. "This is my country," the leader continued, pacing slowly, his boots scraping against the blood-stained pavement. "This is my land, my history, my birthright. And people like you?" He shook his head, chuckling under his breath. "You've been living on borrowed time since the day they let you off those damn plantations. You really thought they were going to let you keep all this?" He glanced back at Marcus, tilting his head slightly, the barest hint of amusement creeping back into his voice. "Tell me, Cain, do you really believe that? Do you really believe that the second men like me stop playing by the rules? Your little illusion holds up?" Marcus said nothing, his hands at his sides, loose but ready, his expression unreadable. He could feel Leon, Darius, and Samuel beside him, all of them coiled, waiting, searching for an opening. But there wasn't one. Not yet. The hostages were too exposed. The blooded sons too well positioned. If they made the wrong move now, people would die before they could stop it. The leader exhaled, turning toward one of the older men among the hostages, a frail-looking man who had been pulled from his home in the chaos, his shirt torn, his lip bloodied from where they had struck him earlier. The leader studied him for a moment before letting out a slow, mocking chuckle. "Jesus, look at you! You fought your whole life, didn't you? Probably one of those old fools who still thinks hard work is enough, that if you just keep your head down, play by the rules, they'll let you die in peace. But here you are, begging for mercy, hoping we let you live." The old man didn't say a word, but his breathing had turned ragged, his entire frame trembling. And then, somewhere in the group of hostages, a quiet, broken voice rose. "Please, please, just let us go." It came from a woman, her hands shaking as she clutched at the young boy beside her. The child couldn't have been more than 13, his face pale beneath the dirt, his eyes locked on the man standing over them. The leader turned to her, sighing heavily, shaking his head. "You people never learn, do you? Always begging, always thinking you can talk your way out of things." He looked back at Marcus, lips curling slightly. "See, this is why we win. Because no matter what happens, you still think someone's coming to save you. Still think you have a place in this world that doesn't involve bowing to men like me." One of the gang members standing beside the woman pressed his gun against her head, just enough to make her whimper. Marcus's fists clenched, but he didn't react. Not yet. "Let them go," Darius said, voice low, steady. The leader snorted. "Or what?" He gestured around them. "You can't shoot. Not with them standing here. You can't charge me. Not with my men holding the line. And even if you could, what's the end game here, Cain?" He let the words settle before chuckling softly. "See, that's your problem. You think this is about survival. It's not. It's about putting things back the way they should be." His smile faded, his eyes dark. "And once this town is ash, no one's ever going to remember you existed." The boy moved. It was so fast, so small, that it barely registered at first. A simple shift, a flicker of movement. But Marcus saw it. The child's fingers found a rock near his feet, barely the size of a fist, but enough. He locked eyes with Marcus, and then he threw it. The rock hit the leader's temple with a sickening crack. It wasn't enough to injure him. Not really. But it was enough. The leader jerked back slightly, startled, and in that half-second, the tension snapped. Marcus moved first, lunging forward before the leader could recover. His elbow drove into the man's jaw, sending him staggering back as chaos erupted around them. Darius and Leon broke left, closing the distance before the gang members could fire, their fists, knives, and elbows turning the tide in an instant. Samuel was already moving toward the hostages, his hands precise, calculated, disarming the closest enemy before he could react, grabbing his rifle and flipping it back against his chest, cracking ribs with the butt of the weapon. Gunfire erupted, but it was controlled now, calculated. Marcus barely registered it as he drove a knee into the leader's ribs, but the man recovered too fast, pivoting, countering with a vicious punch that sent Marcus staggering back. "Big mistake," the leader growled, blood trickling down his forehead from where the rock had hit him. Marcus braced himself, rolling his shoulders, exhaling slowly as they squared off again. Behind them, the battle had shifted, the hostages breaking free, scrambling toward cover as the gang struggled to keep control. The leader didn't look away. "Now it gets fun," he muttered. Marcus smirked slightly, wiping his own split lip with the back of his hand. "Yeah," he said. Then he moved. The fight had shifted, not in the way the blooded sons had expected, but in a way that sealed their fate. The hostages, once trembling in fear, had become something else entirely. They weren't victims anymore. They were fighters. The boy who had thrown the rock was already scrambling, grabbing the gun from the man Samuel had dropped, his hands shaking but his eyes filled with raw defiance. Others followed, kicking weapons away from their captors, dragging the injured to safety, using whatever they had at their disposal to turn the tide. A woman, maybe in her 50s, snatched a knife from one of the fallen and buried it into the leg of a gang member reaching for his rifle. He screamed, but she didn't let go, wrenching the blade deeper with a force that came from generations of survival. The blooded sons had underestimated Haven's rest. They had mistaken patience for weakness, kindness for submission. And now they were paying for it. Marcus barely registered any of it. His focus was locked on the leader. The man wiped blood from his split brow, shaking off the daze, his movements practiced, controlled. This wasn't a man who had risen to power through bravado alone. He had fought before, he had killed before, and he wasn't afraid to do it again. "One-on-one, Kane," he murmured, rolling his shoulders. "You and me, no rifles, no knives, just us." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Fine by me." The leader lunged first, fast for his size, but Marcus had fought men like him before. He sidestepped, dodging the heavy hook aimed for his ribs, and countered with a sharp elbow to the man's jaw. The impact sent a tremor up his arm, but the leader didn't stagger. Instead, he rolled with it, shifting his weight, coming back with a vicious knee that Marcus barely avoided, twisting at the last second to absorb the blow along his side. They were evenly matched. Power against power. Precision against precision. Around them, the battle raged on. The SEALs were no longer just fighting alone. They were commanding. "Keep moving!" Darius called out, ducking behind a toppled car before firing at a cluster of gang members taking cover behind an overturned truck. "Don't stay out in the open! Move in pairs! Cover each other!" Leon grabbed the older man who had been a hostage moments before, shoving a pistol into his hands. "You ever shot before?" The man hesitated, then nodded, gripping the weapon like it was an old friend. "Good," Leon said. "Then back me up." Samuel pulled one of the younger hostages behind cover, pressing a shotgun into his hands, his tone firm but steady. "You don't have to shoot if you don't want to," he told him. "But if you do, you aim for center mass, and you don't hesitate. They sure as hell won't." The kid, barely more than 18, swallowed hard, nodding. His hands were shaking, but he held the shotgun the way his father probably once held a plow, the way his grandfather had held a hammer, the way black men had always held onto the tools they used to survive. And then he took his first shot. A blast of gunfire erupted from his barrel, the recoil knocking him back slightly, but the shot was clean, precise, sending one of the gang members sprawling into the dirt. The boy froze, his breathing heavy, his entire body trembling. Samuel grabbed his shoulder. "Breathe," he said. Again, the kid swallowed and did. The hostages, the town itself, had joined the fight, but Marcus had no time to focus on that. The leader swung again, this time faster, more brutal, a calculated strike that Marcus just barely dodged. The man was strong, but he wasn't reckless. He was fighting to win, and so was Marcus. He feinted left, forcing the leader to overcommit, then drove forward, catching him in the ribs with a sharp, brutal knee. The leader grunted but didn't fall, instead locking onto Marcus's shoulders, slamming his forehead into Marcus's face. Stars exploded behind Marcus's eyes, pain flooded through his skull. But he refused to go down. He gritted his teeth, absorbed the hit, and came back swinging. His fist connected with the leader's throat. The man stumbled, coughing, his grip loosening just enough. Marcus seized the moment. He pivoted, yanked the leader's arm forward, and flipped him over his shoulder, slamming him onto the pavement with bone-cracking force. The leader gasped. Wind knocked from his lungs, but Marcus didn't let him recover. He dropped his knee onto the man's chest, pinning him down. The leader snarled, struggling, but Marcus didn't move, didn't ease up, didn't blink. The fight was over. And the blooded sons knew it. They were losing ground. The ones who had been so eager to burn Haven's Rest were now scrambling, retreating, dying. The hostages had turned into warriors. The town had become a battlefield, and the men who had come thinking they would conquer it were now running for their lives. Marcus exhaled, his grip tightening around the leader's collar. The man stared up at him, his lip curled in defiance, blood smeared across his face. "You think this means anything?" he rasped, his voice thick with exhaustion and pain. "You think this town is safe now?" Marcus didn't respond. He just drove his fist into the man's jaw one last time, knocking him unconscious. The war was almost over, but Haven's Rest wasn't finished yet. The night still burned, but Haven's Rest was no longer a battlefield. It was a hunting ground. The blooded sons had come to take. They had come to destroy, to raze this town until there was nothing left but dust and memory. They had believed themselves untouchable, had carried their hatred like a torch, meant to burn down everything in their path. But now, in the smoldering wreckage of their failed siege, they were running, and there was nowhere left to go. Marcus stood over their unconscious leader, his breathing even despite the exhaustion weighing on his limbs, his fists still aching from the force of the last blow he had delivered. He could hear it, the desperate scrambling sounds of men trying to escape, boots pounding against pavement, engines revving in a last frantic bid for survival. They had realized their mistake too late. Leon's voice came through the radio, sharp, focused. "They're trying to pull out. Looks like they're heading for the East Road, trying to get to the old highway." Darius responded instantly, his voice like stone. "That road's cut off. They're boxed in." Samuel, standing nearby, wiped blood from his face, his expression unreadable. "So, what's the play?" Marcus exhaled slowly, scanning the battlefield, seeing it not just for what it was, but for what it would become. "We end this," he said. Leon's chuckle was grim, humorless. "Copy that." They moved. The people of Haven's Rest had once been a quiet, peaceful town, a place where families thrived, where life had been carved out of resistance, built from the ground up by men and women who had survived too much to ever let something like this happen again. And now they stood shoulder to shoulder with the SEALs, armed, unyielding, refusing to let the enemy slip away. They had seen the kind of men who had come to destroy them, and they would not allow a single one of them to escape. Marcus moved through the wreckage, his rifle at the ready, scanning the streets, watching as the remaining blooded sons tried to scatter, breaking off in small groups, some tossing their weapons aside in surrender, others still clutching their rifles like they thought they could make a final stand. He spotted 3 of them slipping into a side alley, trying to flank around toward an abandoned car. Marcus sprinted after them. They had barely made it to the vehicle when he reached them, stepping into their blind spot, moving before they could react. The first one turned, raising his pistol. Too slow. Marcus grabbed his wrist, twisted hard, breaking the bone with a sickening snap before driving his knee into the man's gut, sending him crumpling to the pavement. The second one lunged with a knife, desperation overtaking reason. But Marcus caught the attack, sidestepped, and slammed the man's head into the car's shattered window, dragging him out as he collapsed, glass embedding itself in his skin. The third tried to run. Marcus didn't let him. A single shot rang out. Not a kill. A warning. The bullet shattered the pavement near the man's feet, and he froze, his breath ragged, his hands trembling as he slowly raised them above his head. "You don't get to leave," Marcus said, his voice quiet but absolute. The man dropped to his knees, knowing there was no escape. Across the battlefield, it was the same everywhere. Darius and his sniper teams picked off runners with unerring precision, their vantage points giving them complete control over the retreating forces. Leon and Samuel led the town's fighters in securing every exit, blocking off roads, trapping the last remnants of the Blooded Sons like animals caught in a cage of their own making. Some tried to surrender, and some didn't. Near the north side of town, one last group of gang members had huddled near a cluster of vehicles, their hands white-knuckled around their weapons, their eyes darting, searching for some kind of opening, some chance to break free, but there was none. Mayor Sarah Carter stood at the front of a dozen townspeople, their weapons trained on the remaining invaders. "You came here thinking you'd wipe us out," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. The voice of a woman who had spent her whole life preparing for a moment like this. "But this town's older than you, stronger than you, and after tonight, we're still going to be standing." The gang members shifted, looking between each other, debating whether to drop their weapons or die with them. One of them snarled, lifting his rifle. 12 shots rang out at once. The body dropped, lifeless. The others surrendered. By the time the first light of dawn began creeping over the horizon, it was over. The remaining Blooded Sons, the ones who had survived, were bound, thrown into trucks, their weapons stripped from them. Some were injured, some still bloody and gasping from the brutality of the night before, but they were all alive, because Haven's Rest wanted them to remember what had happened here. The SEALs stood in the center of it all, watching as the town secured what was left of the enemy, their work finally complete. Samuel exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. "Hell of a night," Leon chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Yeah, and they really thought this was going to go their way." Darius scanned the captured men, his gaze cold. "They thought a lot of things." Marcus remained silent, his eyes tracking the battlefield, committing every detail to memory. He wasn't satisfied yet, not until he knew for certain that the enemy was finished. Leon sighed, looking at him. "So what now?" Marcus exhaled, letting his gaze sweep over the town, the people standing together, whole, unbroken. "Now," he said, his voice quiet, firm, final, "we make sure this never happens again." The morning air was thick with the scent of smoke, blood, and the cold finality of battle. The sky had shifted from the deep black of night to a dull, muted gray, the sun creeping hesitantly over the horizon, as if reluctant to shine light on the destruction left behind. Haven's Rest still stood, but the scars of the war fought here would never fade. Marcus stood near the remnants of what had once been the main road leading into town, watching as the last of the captured Blooded Sons were loaded into trucks, their wrists bound, their faces bloodied, their arrogance long since shattered. Most of them were silent now, empty-eyed, staring at the dirt beneath them because they couldn't bring themselves to look at the people they had come to erase. Others still carried traces of defiance, jaws clenched, bruised lips curled, but none of them spoke, because they had nothing left to say. The remaining townspeople stood in clusters, watching the prisoners being secured, their faces lined with exhaustion, with anger, with the kind of quiet strength that came only from surviving something that should have broken them. The young boy who had thrown the rock at the leader stood near his mother, his small hands still trembling, but his chin was high, his eyes fierce, like a soldier who had earned his place on the battlefield. Darius exhaled, running a hand down his face. "Hell of a cleanup," Leon chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "Yeah, and I bet you $100 the feds are gonna show up just in time to act like they had something to do with this." Marcus didn't respond, didn't shift his gaze from the road, because he had heard the distant hum of approaching vehicles before the others had. And a moment later, the FBI arrived, Black SUVs, a convoy of them, moving like they were on their way to a crime scene they hadn't been fast enough to stop. The lead vehicle braked hard, the others rolling in behind it, doors swinging open almost in unison. Men in suits, in tactical vests, in badges that meant nothing now, spilled onto the dirt road, scanning the destruction like they were walking into something they had expected but never wanted to deal with. Marcus clenched his jaw, watching as a man in a dark suit stepped forward, his eyes sharp, assessing, but there was no urgency in him. No guilt, no weight of responsibility for what had happened here. Just the detached professionalism of a man who had seen enough bloodshed to know when he had arrived too late. The man's gaze swept over the town, the bodies, the captured men. Before settling on Marcus and the others, he didn't introduce himself, didn't offer condolences. He simply adjusted his tie and sighed, the sound grating, hollow, useless. Looks like you boys have been busy. Leon let out a slow, humorless laugh. Are you serious? The man, probably some bureaucratic field agent who had been monitoring this from afar, but never moved when it actually mattered, tilted his head slightly. You want to tell me what happened here? Samuel scoffed, stepping forward, blood still drying on his knuckles, his voice sharp. What happened? What happened is you sat on your asses while we fought a war in our own backyard. Darius folded his arms, eyes cold. We sent out calls. We reported activity. You knew something was coming. And yet, here you are, hours too late, looking real official, pretending like this wasn't the plan all along. The agent exhaled, his expression carefully neutral. We received intelligence about a possible escalation. We were already working on a coordinated response, but Leon cut him off, his voice filled with disgust. But what? But you needed more time? But you were waiting for us to get slaughtered first? Because I got news for you. This escalation wasn't quiet. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't subtle. These bastards rolled in here like an invading army. And you want to stand there and act like you didn't know? The agent's lips pressed into a thin line. You need to understand. Marcus stepped forward, his voice quieter than the others, but somehow heavier, sharper, deadlier. No, you need to understand. You weren't here. You weren't in those streets when they dragged people from their homes. You weren't there when they lined up hostages, ready to execute them. You weren't fighting when they swore they were going to wipe this town off the map. He let the words settle, watching the agent, watching the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. You weren't here. But we were. And we handled it, without you. The silence stretched between them, long and heavy. The agent shifted slightly, glancing at his team, his jaw tightening. There's going to be an investigation. Leon let out a sharp breath. Oh, of course there is. You killed a lot of people tonight. The agent continued, ignoring the sarcasm. Regardless of the circumstances, that's going to draw attention. There will be hearings, questions. I hope you all understand that this isn't just going to go away. Marcus smirked, tilting his head slightly. Good. The agent's brows furrowed. Excuse me. You heard me, Marcus said, stepping even closer, forcing the man to look him in the eye. We're not sweeping this under the rug. We're not letting this get buried under some bureaucratic red tape. We're not letting you spin this into something smaller than what it was. You want an investigation? You want national attention? He gestured toward the wreckage, toward the people standing behind him, toward the bodies of the men who had come to exterminate them. Then go ahead. Investigate. Put this on every damn news channel in the country. Because I want people to see what happened here. I want them to know that when the law failed, when the system failed, when all of you failed, we didn't. Darius crossed his arms, nodding. Yeah, let them see the bodies. Let them see the blood. Let them hear exactly what those men were screaming when they thought they were going to win. Let them hear the hate in their voices. And then let them hear the silence when they realized they weren't walking away. Samuel exhaled, stepping forward. We're not afraid of the truth. But I don't think you can say the same. The agent's face remained neutral. But Marcus could see the shift, the quiet acknowledgement in his eyes that everything they had said was true. This wasn't going away. This wasn't going to be ignored. This town had survived, and the world was going to know exactly what that meant. The agent exhaled slowly, adjusting his tie again. "I'll be in touch." Marcus smirked, stepping back. "You do that." As the FBI team moved further into the town, Marcus turned to his people, the fighters, the survivors, the men and women who had stood their ground when no one else would. And as the sun continued to rise over Haven's Rest, he knew with absolute certainty that this town would never be touched again. Because now the world was watching. The morning air was thick with the scent of smoke, blood, and the cold finality of battle. The sky had shifted from the deep black of night to a dull, muted gray, the sun creeping hesitantly over the horizon, as if reluctant to shine light on the destruction left behind. Haven's Rest still stood, but the scars of the war fought here would never fade. Marcus stood near the remnants of what had once been the main road leading into town, watching as the last of the captured blooded sons were loaded into trucks, their wrists bound, their faces bloodied, their arrogance long since shattered. Most of them were silent now, empty-eyed, staring at the dirt beneath them because they couldn't bring themselves to look at the people they had come to erase. Others still carried traces of defiance, jaws clenched, bruised lips curled, but none of them spoke, because they had nothing left to say. The remaining townspeople stood in clusters, watching the prisoners being secured, their faces lined with exhaustion, with anger, with the kind of quiet strength that came only from surviving something that should have broken them. The young boy who had thrown the rock at the leader stood near his mother, his small hands still trembling, but his chin was high, his eyes fierce, like a soldier who had earned his place on the battlefield. Darius exhaled, running a hand down his face. "Hell of a cleanup," Leon chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "Yeah, and I bet you $100 the feds are gonna show up just in time to act like they had something to do with this." Marcus didn't respond, didn't shift his gaze from the road, because he had heard the distant hum of approaching vehicles before the others had. And a moment later, the FBI arrived. Black SUVs, a convoy of them, moving like they were on their way to a crime scene they hadn't been fast enough to stop. The lead vehicle braked hard, the others rolling in behind it, doors swinging open almost in unison. Men in suits, in tactical vests, in badges that meant nothing now, spilled onto the dirt road, scanning the destruction like they were walking into something they had expected but never wanted to deal with. Marcus clenched his jaw, watching as a man in a dark suit stepped forward, his eyes sharp, assessing, but there was no urgency in him. No guilt, no weight of responsibility for what had happened here. Just the detached professionalism of a man who had seen enough bloodshed to know when he had arrived too late. The man's gaze swept over the town, the bodies, the captured men. Before settling on Marcus and the others, he didn't introduce himself, didn't offer condolences. He simply adjusted his tie and sighed, the sound grating, hollow, useless. "Looks like you boys have been busy." Leon let out a slow, humorless laugh. "Are you serious?" The man, probably some bureaucratic field agent who had been monitoring this from afar, but never moved when it actually mattered, tilted his head slightly. "You want to tell me what happened here?" Samuel scoffed, stepping forward, blood still drying on his knuckles, his voice sharp. "What happened? What happened is you sat on your asses while we fought a war in our own backyard." Darius folded his arms, eyes cold. "We sent out calls. We reported activity. You knew something was coming. And yet, here you are, hours too late, looking real official, pretending like this wasn't the plan all along." The agent exhaled, his expression carefully neutral. "We received intelligence about a possible escalation. We were already working on a coordinated response, but—" Leon cut him off, his voice filled with disgust. "But what? But you needed more time? But you were waiting for us to get slaughtered first? Because I got news for you. This escalation wasn't quiet. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't subtle. These bastards rolled in here like an invading army. And you want to stand there and act like you didn't know? The agent's lips pressed into a thin line. You need to understand. Marcus stepped forward, his voice quieter than the others, but somehow heavier, sharper, deadlier. No, you need to understand. You weren't here. You weren't in those streets when they dragged people from their homes. You weren't there when they lined up hostages, ready to execute them. You weren't fighting when they swore they were going to wipe this town off the map. He let the words settle, watching the agent, watching the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. You weren't here. But we were. And we handled it, without you. The silence stretched between them, long and heavy. The agent shifted slightly, glancing at his team, his jaw tightening. There's going to be an investigation. Leon let out a sharp breath. Oh, of course there is. You killed a lot of people tonight. The agent continued, ignoring the sarcasm. Regardless of the circumstances, that's going to draw attention. There will be hearings, questions. I hope you all understand that this isn't just going to go away. Marcus smirked. Oh, it's not going away. Not unless you make us a deal. The agent narrowed his eyes. Excuse me? You heard me, Marcus said. We've got bodies. We've got names. We've got evidence of exactly how deep this goes, how far their network stretches. You think this was just a bunch of dumb racists with guns? No. They had help. They had federal resources. They had men on the inside. And I promise you, if this story gets out the way it should, people in your own offices are gonna start sweating real fast. The agent's jaw clenched slightly, but Marcus could already see it in his eyes. The realization that they weren't just dealing with survivors, they were dealing with men who had spent their whole lives dismantling enemy networks. Darius exhaled, stepping up beside Marcus. So, here's what's gonna happen. You're going to make sure we get inside. We want positions where we can do more than just fight in the shadows. We want real power. Places where we can make real change. Leon crossed his arms. And in return, maybe this whole thing stays clean. Maybe we let you spin it the way you need to. Control the narrative before it turns into something you can't handle. But if you think for a second that you can just sweep this under the rug without us, try it. We'll go public before you can even file the first report. The agent's face remained neutral, but Marcus could see the shift, the quiet acknowledgement in his eyes that everything they had said was true. This wasn't going away. This wasn't going to be ignored. The agent exhaled slowly, adjusting his tie again. I'll be in touch. Marcus smirked, stepping back. You do that. As the FBI team moved further into the town, Marcus turned to his people. The fighters, the survivors, the men and women who had stood their ground when no one else would. And as the sun continued to rise over Haven's Rest, he knew, with absolute certainty, that this town would never be touched again. Because now, the world was watching. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows over the battlefield that had once been a quiet southern town. Haven's Rest still stood, but the echoes of the night before lingered in the air, in the broken windows and scorched pavement, in the lingering smell of gunpowder and blood. But this wasn't a place of mourning. This was a place that had fought back. Marcus stood at the center of it all, near what had become their rallying point, the steps of the old town hall, its columns streaked with smoke, its wooden door splintered from a bullet that had barely missed its mark. The people of Haven's Rest had gathered here not because they had to, but because they needed to. They needed to know what came next. He could see it in their faces, the exhaustion, the grief, the simmering anger that had not yet settled. Some were bandaged, others bruised, but none of them were broken. These were not the same people who had watched their town be terrorized in silence, who had feared the night and the men who came with fire and hate in their hearts. No, these were warriors now. Marcus let the weight of the moment settle before speaking. It's over. They're not coming back. A murmur spread through the crowd, not of relief, but of acceptance. Darius stood beside him, arms crossed, his eyes sharp as they tracked the townspeople. "But that doesn't mean we just go back to normal," Leon exhaled, shaking his head. "No, because normal is what got us here in the first place." Samuel stepped forward, voice steady, even. "The FBI is here. Late, useless, but here. And we made it real clear that we're not letting them walk away without making this mean something." He let the words settle before continuing. "They're offering us positions, real power, places where we can start making the kinds of changes that keep things like this from happening again." There was a shift in the crowd, some murmuring in quiet surprise, others nodding, waiting for the full picture. Marcus scanned their faces. "It's not enough." Silence followed. "They don't want this to be a national story," he continued, his voice slow, measured. "They'd rather keep it quiet, package it up, wrap it in red tape, let it fade from people's minds like every other time something like this happens. But that's not happening. Not this time." Mayor Carter stepped forward, her presence just as commanding as his, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "How do we stop them from burying it?" Leon smirked slightly. "By making sure they don't get the chance." Darius nodded, stepping closer. "News crews are going to come. Hell, they're probably already on their way. We don't wait for them to dictate the story. We take control of it ourselves." A young woman near the front, her arms still wrapped in a makeshift sling, frowned slightly. "How?" Marcus met her gaze. "We show them the truth. We make them see exactly what happened here. We don't let them turn this into a story about a clash or a dispute. We don't let them water it down. We don't let them say both sides. We make sure that when the cameras roll, the world sees the reality, that this was a town full of black men and women who were targeted for no other reason than existing, who were meant to be erased, and who stood their ground and won." The murmur in the crowd grew louder, anger sharpening into something more focused, more determined. Samuel nodded. "We need to control the visuals. When those reporters get here, we make sure they see the aftermath exactly how it is. The bodies of the men who came to kill us? Still here. The bullet holes in our homes? Still here. The people who fought back and lived to tell the story? Front and center." An older man in the crowd, his face still bruised from the night before, shook his head. "And if they try to twist it? Try to make us look like the aggressors?" Darius smirked slightly. "Then we give them something they can't spin. We don't just give them a story. We give them names. Names of every single person who was here, who stood against them. Names of the men who came in here thinking they'd kill us all. Names of the people who made sure that didn't happen." Marcus exhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd. "And we make sure people know that this wasn't just about one town. This was about every town like it. Every place that's been threatened. Every place that's been forgotten. Every place that's been waiting for someone to fight back. We make sure the world knows that what happened here isn't just history. It's a warning." Silence followed, but this time it wasn't uncertainty. It was resolution. Mayor Carter stepped closer, looking at Marcus, then at the people behind him. "We'll need to coordinate. We need statements. We need evidence. And we need to make sure they can't drown us out." Leon chuckled. "We know how to run an operation. We'll handle it." Marcus nodded. "Good. Because this town fought too hard to let someone else tell its story." The sun had risen fully now, casting light on Haven's Rest, not as a town in mourning, but as a town that had survived. They would not be erased. And they would make damn sure the world knew it. The town moved like a single unified force, each person knowing their role, each step taken with deliberate precision. They had fought a war together. Now, they would make sure the world knew exactly what that war had been. The bodies had been left where they fell, a stark reminder of what had happened here. The blackened remains of vehicles still smoldered. Bullet-ridden walls stood like silent witnesses, and the blood staining the pavement had not yet been washed away. Because this was not a crime scene to be covered up. This was a battlefield that told the truth, and that truth would not be erased. Marcus stood near the line of captured men, watching as the blooded sons were forced to kneel, their hands bound behind their backs, their eyes downcast. Some were still stunned, struggling to process what had happened. Others carried the remnants of defiance, though that fire had dulled, flickering but not yet entirely extinguished. And then there was him, the leader. He had been stripped of his weapons, of his rank, of whatever twisted sense of power he had once carried. He was no longer a conqueror. He was a prisoner. The blood drying at his temple was the only thing marking his fight. But it wasn't the physical wounds that had undone him. It was the loss. Marcus crouched in front of him, meeting his gaze. "You lost," he said, his voice quiet but firm, letting the words settle, letting the weight of them sink into the man's bones. The leader exhaled through his nose, his face unreadable. For now. Darius, standing nearby, let out a sharp breath. "You still don't get it, do you?" Leon stepped closer, arms crossed. "This isn't just about you. It's not about your gang. You didn't just lose a fight. You lost everything you were trying to prove. You thought you'd walk in here and wipe us off the map. Instead, you got wiped out. And now the whole world is gonna watch as your people get paraded in front of every news camera in the country as nothing more than failed terrorists." The leader's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Samuel crouched beside Marcus, tilting his head slightly as he studied the man. "What's the end game here, huh? You think your movement survives this? You think the people who backed you, who funded you, who whispered in your ear, are gonna stick their necks out for you now?" He shook his head. "Nah, they're gonna bury you, same as we did, because you're a liability now, a failure. And people like you don't get second chances." Marcus let the silence stretch before speaking again. "But here's the part that should really piss you off," he said, his tone almost conversational. "The more you tried to tear this place down, the stronger you made it. You thought you'd erase it? Nah, you just made it something untouchable." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You made this place legendary." The leader's fingers curled into fists behind his back. But still, he said nothing. Marcus straightened, nodding toward the FBI agents who stood waiting, their presence now little more than a formality. "Take them." The agent in charge gave a sharp nod, and the prisoners were hauled to their feet, shoved toward the waiting SUVs. They would be paraded before the courts, locked away in cages, their names forever attached to the humiliation of their failure. But Marcus knew it wouldn't end there. The blooded sons had always been more than just one group. They were a mindset, a festering sickness that ran deeper than any one battle. There would always be more of them, more men like this, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. But they would never come for Haven's Rest again, because this town had made itself untouchable. Mayor Carter stepped beside Marcus, watching as the last of the prisoners were loaded up. "And that's the end of them?" Marcus exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "No, but it's the end of them here." She nodded, then turned toward the town square, where the people of Haven's Rest had gathered. News crews had already arrived, reporters setting up, cameras pointed toward the destruction, the microphones waiting to capture the voices of those who had survived. Marcus watched as the people prepared to tell their own story. Not a story of victimhood, not a story of loss, a story of defiance, of survival, of victory. He stepped forward, joining the others, knowing that this moment, this fight, this town, this history, would never be erased. Haven's Rest had won, and the world would never forget. It started as a single story. A local news station picked it up first. Grainy footage of burned-out vehicles, bullet-ridden buildings, bodies lined up in the dirt, their weapons scattered at their feet. It was the kind of story that usually disappeared before it could make an impact, the kind of truth that was often buried before the world had a chance to see it. But this time, it didn't disappear. By midday, it had spread across state lines, picked up by larger networks, dissected on morning news shows, debated by pundits who had never set foot in a place like Haven's Rest. By nightfall, it was national. The footage was everywhere. Helicopters flew over the town, cameras zooming in on the destruction, on the people standing in defiance, on the faces of those who had fought and won. It was undeniable. A town of black men and women had been attacked by a white supremacist militia in what should have been a massacre. But instead of being erased, they had wiped out their attackers. Instead of mourning, they had triumphed. The narrative began shifting almost immediately. At first, there were attempts to paint it as a conflict, as if it had been some kind of mutual battle, as if both sides had been equally at fault. But the truth was too stark, too brutal, too obvious to be twisted. The interviews sealed it. The people of Haven's Rest did not let the cameras control the story. They told it themselves. A mother, standing in front of the charred remains of her home, spoke of the night she hid her children in a closet, while men broke down her door. An elderly man, his face still bruised, spoke of the moment he thought he would die. The moment he realized his town would not let that happen. The young boy, the same one who had thrown the rock, stood beside his mother, staring into the camera with eyes far older than his years. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just said, "We fought, and we won." And then there were the SEALs. The networks couldn't ignore them. 4 men, highly trained, warriors who had served their country only to find that their country wasn't ready to protect them. And when the questions came, when the reporters pressed, pushed, tried to spin, Marcus, Darius, Leon, and Samuel did exactly what they had planned. They told the truth. They didn't soften it. They didn't let it be drowned out in vague political discourse. They laid it out plainly. The blooded sons had come to erase a town. The government had known something was coming and had done nothing. The FBI and local law enforcement had stood back, waiting to clean up the aftermath, watching from a distance as if they weren't complicit in their silence. And that silence was the real crime. By the second day, the headlines had changed. Haven's Rest, the town that refused to die. Where was law enforcement? Black Navy SEALs save town abandoned by government. The FBI tried to control the damage, but it was too late. They were being ripped apart on live television, their failures exposed in ways they couldn't contain. The local police department was even worse off. Journalists began uncovering links between officers and the blooded sons, exposing the quiet alliances that had allowed this to happen in the first place. Resignations followed. Careers ended overnight, and through it all, the SEALs became something else. They weren't just survivors. They were heroes. Public figures began calling for investigations. Politicians scrambled to get ahead of the outrage, demanding accountability. Celebrities spoke out. Activists rallied. Donations poured into Haven's Rest, rebuilding efforts forming before the ash had even settled. And then the FBI came back. This time, they weren't late. This time, they weren't here to make excuses. They were here to make a deal. Marcus sat across from the same agent who had walked into Haven's Rest days before, back when the town was still smoldering, back when he had thought he was the one in control. Now, the man looked tired, beaten down by the weight of his own agency's failure. "You made this bigger than we expected," the agent admitted. Marcus didn't blink. "Good." The agent exhaled, folding his hands on the table. "We can't bury this. And frankly, at this point, we wouldn't even try. You put us in a position where we have no choice but to act. We need people on the inside, people with experience, people with your skill set. We're offering you full clearance, high-level operational roles, not just field work, real influence." Marcus let the words settle before speaking. "And what about Haven's Rest?" The agent hesitated. Leon, sitting beside Marcus, leaned forward. "No more surveillance. No more excuses. If anyone even thinks about coming back here, we get priority jurisdiction. The town gets federally protected status, and any organization that so much as looks in this direction gets shut down before it starts." The agent sighed, nodding. "Agreed." Samuel rubbed his jaw, watching the man carefully. "And what about the people behind this? We know this wasn't just the blooded sons. We know they had backing, money. Someone trained them. Someone supplied them. So what's your next move? The agent hesitated again. Marcus leaned in, his voice cold. Because if you're not making a move, we will. The agent exhaled sharply. We're working on it. Darius scoffed. Work harder. The silence stretched between them, but this time it was the FBI that was waiting for permission. Marcus finally nodded. We'll take the deal, but understand something. This isn't about politics for us. This isn't about bureaucracy. You put us in those positions, and we're not playing by the rules you're used to. The agent met his gaze. We know. The deal was done. Marcus stood, the others following. They had spent their entire lives fighting wars overseas, taking orders from men who only saw them as tools. This was different. This was their war now. As they stepped outside, the town was still alive, thriving in the aftermath of what should have destroyed it. People moved with purpose, rebuilding, organizing, standing taller than they had before. This wasn't just about Haven's Rest anymore. This was about every town like it. Every place that had been left to fend for itself. And they weren't done fighting. Not even close. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends. And subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.